Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel where we like to talk all things finance and investing. In today's video, I'm going to talk about 5 thoughts for the markets for 2025. So let's get into it. Number 1 thought for 2025 when it comes to the markets is volatility. We did not see much volatility in 2024 with the exception of August. If you remember the yen carry trade unwinding and the market sold off very aggressively. But look what happened since then. It bounced back and has actually finished up and around all-time highs. I wouldn't be surprised if in 2025 we get a lot more volatility than we saw in 2024. We've seen back-to-back years of 20% plus on the S&P 500, and almost definitely that's going to lead to more volatility. Another thing to think about, AI spending. These companies have been spending billions of dollars in the AI space, and they're looking to get a return on that. When earnings season comes through in the US in January, if some of those companies are not reporting good returns or their outlooks are not great, you can expect an overreaction in sell-offs, in my opinion. So I think we could see some early volatility even in January. We've seen some volatility recently with the Fed Chairman Jay Powell spoke just the other day in reference to interest rate projections for 2025. So at the moment, it feels like any bad news at all and the markets could sell off aggressively. But don't worry, volatility is something you should embrace. It creates opportunities. Keep an eye on the volatility index, also known as the VIX. Generally, it's not a bad time to be buying stocks or ETFs when the VIX is high, particularly if you're a long-term investor, as you should be. So market thought number 2 for 2025, politics will absolutely dominate the markets. Trump is coming back into the White House in January, and with him, he's bringing a lot of talk around tariffs, NATO spending, defense budgets, all of this sort of thing, ramping it up with the EU and China primarily. We can fully expect tariffs to be announced in the very early days. That's likely to have some sort of an impact on the markets as well. European defense spending was a big theme in 2024, and that sector did quite well. Expect more of the same in 2025, sadly, due to some of the military conflicts we're seeing. And Trump is also saying he wants European nations to be spending up to 5% of GDP in their defense spending. That is a big number from the 2% that was previously being discussed. So lots of pressure being put on the EU, not just from Trump, and tariffs and things like that, but China's competing in the EV space as well and automobiles overall. So the EU is going to be facing a little bit of pressure here, but overall, tariffs, defense spending, unfortunately the military skirmishes, expect politics and geopolitics to dominate in 2025. All right, number 3, thoughts of markets on 2025, crypto and commodities. Crypto has had a big 2024 for sure. Bitcoin breaking 100,000. And if you saw my recent video on Tom Lee's forecast for 2025, he actually calls for crypto to get up to $250,000 in 2025. So expect cryptocurrencies to dominate as well and be a big theme in 2025 for sure. It's a pretty volatile asset. You maybe want to think about only 5 to 10% of your serious portfolio going into it, but expect some big moves. Trump is reportedly to be a big fan of cryptocurrency, talks about making it a strategic asset reserve, expect it to be more mainstream, so we could see some big moves in crypto next year. When it comes to commodities, 2024, the year of the metals had a great year actually. And as government debt continues to increase, inflation sticky on the to come down as well and get to the targets of the central banks around the world, you're gonna probably see more headlines around gold and some potentially big moves in gold as well in 2025. Don't forget, unfortunately, geopolitics, uncertainty, wars, trade wars, all of this sort of stuff, when that's kicking off, gold does tend to do well. So gold will be another theme, something to look out for in 2025 as well. The 4th thought for the markets on 2025 all comes down to inflation and growth numbers. There's some talk around stagflation. What stagflation is you get no or low growth, plus you get higher GDP. It's not a place you want an economy to be at all. So there's been talk of that happening. I think it's maybe a little bit overdone. There was talk about this happening a few years ago and it never transpired. But stagflation is not something we want. Inflation has come down an awful lot, but it's still above the 2% target. And growth in some countries, like the UK, who printed a minus 0.1% GDP recently, are starting to have worries about stagflation. If the central banks can't get inflation down, they can't cut interest rates further, and that's going to stymie growth even further. So inflation and growth rates are going to be a big deal in 2025. Goldman Sachs is forecasting worldwide GDP to come in at around 2.7% next year, which is actually quite good. In the US, they're forecasting 2.5% GDP. Not bad at all. When it comes to Europe, though, it's going to be a lot lower, something like 0.8%. So it's really going to vary depending on the region. But what we're seeing with these forecasts, US dominance again in macro GDP growth figures. And with Trump tax cuts coming in and his incentives for companies to build and manufacture in the US, might we see an increase in inflation again? That's a possibility, because with growth, you can get inflation. So the two can sometimes go hand in hand. Let's see what happens with some of those policies and its impact inflation and growth. All right, so the fifth thought on the markets for 2025, it's interest rates. There's probably nothing that moves the economy, the stock market, as much as interest rates. That's why they get so much attention. At the moment, the Fed wants to cut a little bit more, but they're struggling to do so because interest has stayed above their 2% target. It's around 2.7%. And that last bit is always the hardest to get it down. They can't really cut rates if the economy remains too strong, because that will potentially reignite inflation as well. So interest rates are going to be the theme. When Chairman Jay Powell spoke recently at the most recent meeting, just the other day, he actually projected a much more hawkish tone, meaning he favored kind of higher rates, if you will, or at least keeping rates where they're at. And the market went into his tailspin and sold off 3%. So we may not see the interest rate cuts that the market was projecting only a couple of weeks ago. So 2025, interest rates will dominate, and where will they go? It's a little hard to cut if inflation is still being sticky in and above the 2%. And that's the same for the UK and Europe as well. Also, what if tariffs in the US increase inflation? Then that could be another problem around interest rates as well, and make the life of Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve a lot harder. So there you have it, my 5 thoughts on the markets for 2025. What do you think? There's a lot in there to digest and unpack. Let me know in the comments section what your thoughts on any of these are. What are you planning to do in the markets for 2025? If you like the video, just give me a like. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. It really helps me to grow, produce more content like this. Really appreciate if you would do that. And as always, I wish you all the best in your savings and investment journey.